So I'm from Ohio. I was born in Dayton, went to high school in Mansfield, went to college in Cleveland, and now live in Columbus. I lived in other states, but I'm pretty sure I'm pretty Ohioan. For the last few years, I've been taking anti-racism classes, and I often try to take the time to ground the conversation in the anti-black history of the community wherever I'm teaching. Often I'm met with a sentiment that goes something like this: Adam, this is Ohio, it's a northern state, things like that only happened in the South. Well, if you're saying something like that, you probably learned Ohio history in one of our fine Ohio schools, and you should interrogate what you learned about your own origins. Worse still, there are those among us who insist that claiming white people in the past were anti-black racists is somehow modern revisionism or excusing them for being products of their time. To help with that, this episode I want to talk about The Color Line in Ohio, a history of race prejudice in a typical northern state. It's a 1913 book on the history and then current state of racism in the state of Ohio, written by a Harvard-trained sociologist named Frank Quillin. So I'm going to kick this off with a word of warning. This episode is going to be different because it isn't a book I really respect. Quillin is a white sociologist from the early 20th century, and that has its own baggage as a science. And while he wants you to know that he's read Du Bois, he also spends slightly less than half of his word count on contemporary conditions, uncritically letting racist white people justify their racism. While there is a possible reading of those portions that Quillin thinks these people are bad and is letting them dig their own graves, I don't really think that's what's going on here. Quillin often finds what he refers to as a better class of black people who, quote, know their place, who puppet those white sentiments. And he positions this better class in contrast to early 20th century Southern black migrants who are culturally different and antagonize whites by claiming their own space and expecting equal rights. What makes them culturally different? Well, Quillin tells us that no black person outside of Cleveland can get a well-paying job, and they're passed over for promotions at every turn. Then that whites condemn those Southern transplants for being lazy and spending their meager free money on entertainment. Quillin tells us that every Protestant church in the state is segregated, and then that white people condemn those Southern transplants for not going to church and spending Sunday partying, their only day off from menial and humiliating low-paying jobs. Like I said, there's an ironic juxtaposition to how he presents this information, but he never seems to outright make those connections himself. Still, the book is a fascinating look at 19th century Ohio history and at the current state of things at the beginning of the 20th century. So let's jump in. Ohio became a state on March 1st, 1803. Quillin took a look at the first Ohio Constitutional Convention and their own notes to see how these framers considered black people already living in the state and the prospect of more. It's not great. While they didn't outright vote to ban black people from living in the state or to deport those who already did, they considered it, and they did nearly decide to make Ohio a slave state. A proposition to make slavery illegal in Ohio, except as a form of criminal punishment, passed by a single vote. We were one guy getting back from lunch late away from being the northernmost slave state of the time. The first draft of Ohio's first constitution granted suffrage and therefore citizenship to only white male inhabitants. There was a proposition to strike the word white there, offering citizenship to any man in the territory. That was voted down 19-14. Next came a vote on whether or not black men could have citizenship at some future date if they individually went through some arbitrary, undefined process that white men didn't have to go through. This one somehow passed. On a roll, the small group of framers who thought that black people might possibly be black people then suggested that any man, no matter his skin color, whose father was a citizen, should become a citizen. That one failed by 1 vote and triggered a backlash. The next motion passed. It said that no Negro or mulatto would ever be eligible to any office, civil or military, within the state. The next vote was to overturn the paltry promise of possible suffrage that had previously passed. This one was a tie, but then the convention president, Edwin Tiffin, broke the tie, and black men were once again left with no possibility of citizenship, no matter how vague. Then, in a stunning upset, the next vote was to overturn the one about black people never, ever being eligible for public office in Ohio because it said forever, and that was just bad policy writing. That won by 1 vote, and that last one got everyone so nervous that they might accidentally build a racially equitable society that they threw out all of the race-related motions and went back to writing a constitution that promised citizenship to white male inhabitants and just didn't mention anyone else. Now, before we write off that constitution as a product of its time, let's quickly remember that at least a third of the white men at the convention consistently voted that black people are in fact people. People at the time knew what was right. They were just voted down. Having failed to adequately punish black people for daring to exist in the state constitution, the state legislature went to work immediately. In 1804, Ohio passed laws banning any black person from moving into the state unless they could provide freedom papers. Black people who were already here had until June of 1805 to register themselves and their families with their freedom papers and a processing fee per person. White employers were barred from hiring any black person without proper papers and required to pay a $500 fine and 50 cents per day restitution if an enslaver showed up claiming that employee belonged to them. In 1807, the state further mandated that black people moving into the state should provide a $500 bond per person to guarantee that they were good people who wouldn't end up on welfare, not that they could legally be on welfare. That's the equivalent of $11,000 today. In a class I taught a few years ago where these early Ohio anti-black laws came up, a German immigrant who happened to be in the class that day pointed out that all of those laws sounded really familiar to him. They mirror modern-day immigration laws that set up a system that inherently punishes people who want to immigrate to the U.S. What makes the connection perhaps even more plain is Quillin's discovery of an 1827 media sensation over a supposed migrant caravan. 500 free black people headed to Ohio from Virginia that led to weeks of hand-wringing in newspapers. A letter to a Chillicothe paper summed up the average white man's response to those news stories and seems to have been written by the 1827 version of Rush Limbaugh. Quote, "The people of Ohio are bound in justice to themselves to adopt some counteracting measure. Many people here are of the opinion that we may be compelled to introduce slavery in Ohio in self-defense." To round out the 1807 session, Ohio's General Assembly also banned black people from testifying on any court case involving a white person in any way, even if those black people were the victims or, say, the only witnesses about a murderer who would otherwise go free. In 1831, a law passed that only qualified electors could sit on juries, a reminder that qualified electors meant white men. 1838 established public schools, but only for white kids. Then weirdly, in 1848, we actually integrated Ohio schools on one condition. If any single white parent or any voter in the district, any one person, objected to integration, it wouldn't happen. Someone objected in every district except Cleveland. With an objection came an alternative funding system where taxes on white-owned property went to white schools and taxes on black-owned property went to black schools, establishing a segregated property tax-based system that still exists today, despite the fact that the Ohio Supreme Court itself said it was illegal in 1997. Also, I don't think I need to recap all those legal and financial restrictions on black life to point out that black people didn't exactly own a lot of taxable property to fund schools with. Quillin, in one of the first instances of me angrily writing wow in the margins of a book, attempts to justify these anti-black laws, or at least puppets people who were justifying them. He writes, "Were they intelligent citizens? They had been kept by law in complete illiteracy. In Africa, their ancestors had lived in heathen ignorance, and in America, the opportunities of Christian enlightenment for them had been very slight. Many were lazy and shiftless. Almost all of them had been trained as pieces of machinery to do the work of a certain kind that required no thinking. Generally, this kind of work was not to be had in the North. Many of the Negroes that came from the South were old and worn out. In this state, they had been freed by their masters and, being unable to stand the rigors of the laws against free-colored people in their native states, drifted north. What then was there about the Negroes to appeal for help from the white people of Ohio? But one thing, their utter helplessness, their abject need for philanthropy. And this did not make a strong impression upon the majority of voters in Ohio. My man, they didn't have an abject need for philanthropy. They had a God-given right to justice that was continually denied by white men in power. Even other contemporary products of their time in the U.S. recognized that Ohio was evil at the time. Quillin quotes William Jay, John Jay's son, who wrote, "Prejudice against the Negro attains its rankest luxuriance, not in the rice swamps of Georgia or in the sugar fields of Louisiana, but upon the prairies of Ohio." The anti-black laws of early 18th century were largely repealed by 1849, largely through the advocacy of Quakers and political maneuvering. But even in this repeal, the General Assembly also added an amendment to ban black people from owning any real estate that thankfully didn't pass. This brings us to 1850, where the census reveals that there were in fact enslaved people living in the state, a state that was ostensibly free. And criminalization of black life had led to a state penitentiary population that was disproportionately black by a factor of 9 in 1850. Oh, hey, we've improved there. Today, black people are only disproportionately imprisoned in Ohio by a factor of 3.5%. 1850 was also a new Ohio Constitutional Convention, where once again deporting all black people out of the state and barring any from coming in was discussed. Black male citizenship was voted down, and a funding for the colonization of Liberia was only voted down because they thought paying for black people to leave the U.S. would encourage more black people to move to Ohio in order to get that free ticket to Africa. A whole onion of racism, that one. Post-Civil War, Ohio did not improve. In 1867, a reactionary change in state government rescinded Ohio's ratification of the 14th Amendment and followed up with an act to preserve the purity of elections, mandating 3 to 10 years in prison for anyone who pretended to be a white male inhabitant in order to vote. Because calls for election integrity have always meant stopping people of color from voting. Even after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, Ohio's culture of white supremacy, built on a legal foundation of anti-blackness, refused to yield. For instance, when schools were legally desegregated in the 1870s, New Richmond responded by closing schools for 3 solid months. Other communities took the nonviolent option of refusing to renew or issue new leases for black people to live there, thereby forcing them to move, or the much more overtly violent option of just beating black residents, burning their property, and refusing them business until they left. In part 2 of the book, Quillin interviews black and white residents in cities across the state to see what life is like at the end of the first decade of the 20th century. Dayton, Cleveland, Springfield, Columbus, and the Ohio River sunset town Quillin himself was born in, Syracuse in Meigs County. Since I live in Columbus, I'd like to focus on it, though despite Quillin's opening claims of uniqueness, every major city in Ohio except Cleveland is described in similar terms. Quillin opens this chapter, quote, "Columbus, the capital of Ohio, has a feeling toward the Negroes all its own. In all my travels in the state, I found nothing just like it. It is not so much a rabid feeling of prejudice against Negroes simply because their skin is black, as it is a bitter hatred of them." He adds, "The white people seem to think that the latecomers, that is, the southern migrants, are prone to assert their rights a little too freely. The feeling against the Negroes is bitter in the extreme." Quillin describes a city in which all social lives, including Protestant churches, are racially segregated. The only jobs black men can get are street cleaners, sewer workers, janitors, and other general labor in the steel mills, foundries, and fertilizer factories, where they make less than their white counterparts. The unions don't accept black members, and on the off chance that a black man arrives with his union card, the white union workers refuse to work with them. Early forms of environmental racism mean black families are segregated to neighborhoods downwind from the railroads on the Near East Side or surrounded by the mills, factories, and landfills of the South Side. Hotels and restaurants refuse to serve them, and some of the largest employers in the city refuse to hire black men at all. The streetcar company fired hundreds and refused to hire any more, claiming that they were all shiftless and lazy down to the man. Now, there are some who will say, "Adam, this was all a long time ago. It was pretty rich when just a few minutes ago you said Ohio's a northern state and none of this stuff happened here anyway." To follow that thread of history, we'll have to leave Quillin's work. First came racial deed restrictions, where property could not legally be sold to people of color all over the city. By 1920, over a quarter of new builds in Columbus had some restriction against selling the property to black people, Jewish people, Asians, or Southern Europeans. In 1947, a local African-American paper writes that over the previous 20 years, there had only been 300 houses built in Columbus that could legally be sold to black people. While racial deed restrictions would be outlawed in 1948, the enforceable language just became more hidden, referring instead to contentious groups. A homeowner association in Upper Arlington was taken to court for blocking black residents in 1977 and convicted. Redlining started in the mid-30s and codified into law the already established race divisions in the city because the maps were made by local real estate agents, developers, and bankers. The initial program was to refinance home loans to people during the Depression to keep them in their houses. So white people in blue and green neighborhoods are able to keep their homes and pass that wealth to their children, while black and poor people in red neighborhoods lose their houses and are displaced and forced into the rental market. For decades after their initial use, private banks would use redlining data to deny new loans and refinancing, dispossessing even more black families. Zoning laws then further codify race lines legally by putting economic minimums on who could live in certain areas and keeping those who owned property in poorer, more dense areas from improving their property for increased resale value, such as minimum build costs and square footages in Upper Arlington, or setback distances and minimum clearance that kept garages and other improvements from being built in Old Town East. The GI Bill promised home loans for war vets without regard to race, but black vets couldn't use a loan if no one would sell a house to them or if local banks refused to issue loans for redlined areas. In 1947, a nearly 200-home subdivision was built specifically for black vets in the southern corner of Hanford Village, over half of which would be destroyed when Interstate 70 cut through it in 1961. The interstate predominantly cut through black neighborhoods. In fact, 270 was initially laid out to go through Clintonville Beechwold, just north of the Graceland Shopping Center, but a letter-writing campaign to the governor got that changed. Black neighborhoods did not have the political clout for such a campaign. 70 decimated Hanford Village, 670 destroyed Flytown completely, and Fort Hayes Interchange took out St. Philip's Episcopal Church, a VFW Hall, an Elks Lodge, Thigpen's Drugstore, the Oxford Hotel, the Belmont Club, and other social centers of life in Bronzeville. While the path spared Shiloh Baptist and St. Paul's AME, St. Paul's was less cut off on the wrong side of the highway from the rest of the community. Meanwhile, in Bronzeville and other parts of the city, social segregation Quillin spoke of in 1913 continues to this day. Nearly 25% of black families in town had been displaced by the construction of the highways by the time I-67 was finished in 1985, forced into rental markets with landlords who knew they had a captive customer base and priced accordingly. The highways bifurcated what neighborhoods they didn't destroy and cut the Near East Side off from downtown. The heart of Old Town was still largely white into the 50s, but highways offered incentive and means to leave. White families weren't forced to sell, though, and instead held on to those properties, subdivided them into apartments, and became landlords. Another big cause of white flight in the 50s was Brown versus the Board of Education, which forced desegregation of the schools. In that same decade, the white suburbs exploded. Witherington's population grew 331%. Upper Arlington's 215%, Hilliard a whopping 823%, and Whitehall, Minerva Park, and Valley View were all founded as white-controlled enclaves surrounded by Columbus, but politically and financially separate from Columbus, removing tax revenues that led to further disparities in education, policing, available fresh food, healthcare, and other metrics. To take only education as an example, this white flight led to a greater financial crisis in Columbus City schools that would lead to another Supreme Court case in 1977 on racial inequalities in schools, which in turn led to the beginning of busing as a means of desegregation, which would last into the 90s, which in turn triggered another white flight, with Dublin's population growing 2,300% between 1970 and 1990. Our society is built and continues to function within the parameters of a foundation of inequality and iniquity on a systemic level, a multi-layered, systematic dispossession of black and indigenous lives to the benefit of white people. Certainly some white people have benefited much more than others, but that is all the more reason for those of us who grew up poor, benefiting less from that dispossession, to stand with our siblings across race lines and demand not just an end to this system, but a true repentance, a repairing of the damage that has been done and built on over centuries, a repaying of a debt so great it will take all of our collective weight to even start to bend the arc toward justice.